Though Sumner won the election, Wilson had the highest of spirits. Now the president of the Massachusetts Senate and a leading figure in the Free Soilers, Wilson had reached the peak of his career so far. This is Henry Wilson and the Civil War. In his first few months in office, Massachusetts voters and Free Soilers became upset as Senator Sumner seemed to remain quiet on the subject of slavery. In many letters to Sumner, Wilson, never doubting his friend's intentions, attempted to push him towards a stronger anti-slavery stance in the Senate. Wilson's advice was realized in Sumner's 1852 Freedom National speech, rebuking the Fugitive Slave Act and regaining the confidence of anti-slavery advocates across the country. Rising from his early days in Farmington, Wilson's ambitions continued to push forward. Though content in his position in the State House, Wilson admired a greater office. As the 1852 elections came near, Wilson had his eye on the governor's office. In public, Wilson denied any desire for the governorship, but in private, he rallied his Free Soil colleagues for support. At the Massachusetts Free Soil Convention of 1852, many delegates rallied around a Wilson nomination, though Horace Mann, an education reform advocate, and the man who today many call the father of the American public education system, was nominated as the Free Soil candidate. Wilson took his loss roughly, though he remained optimistic as usual. He planned to take another attempt at the nomination in another year, and received the nomination for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Though he didn't win in the election, he lost by just 93 votes in a cycle where Free Soilers lost across the state by thousands. While not a win, the strong performance spoke to the local popularity of Wilson and his future prospects for what he hoped would be realized in the governorship. Though state affairs occupied much of Wilson's time, his national role as the chair of the Free Soil Party continued to be of importance. The presidential election of 1852 came rushing to his attention. The Whigs sought to nominate Winfield Scott, a military icon going all the way back to the War of 1812, and who would later serve in the Civil War. The Democrats nominated the incumbent Franklin Pierce, a slaveholder and sharp enemy of Free Soil Democratic Coalition. At the Free Soil Convention, 3 men attempted to secure the presidential nomination. Salmon P. Chase, a U.S. Senator from Ohio, who was popular with Democrats, John Hale, a U.S. Senator from New Hampshire and former Democrat, and finally Charles Francis Adams, the Free Soiler vice presidential candidate in 1848 and the aristocratic foe of Henry Wilson. At the convention, famed abolitionist and later friend of Wilson, Frederick Douglass gave a rousing speech attacking slavery. "Nowhere has God ordained that this beautiful land be cursed with bondage by enslaving men. Slavery has no rightful existence anywhere. The slaveholders not only forfeit their right to liberty, but to life itself. The earth is God's, and it ought to be covered with righteousness, and not slavery. We expect this great national convention to lay down some such principles as this. What we want is not a temporary organization for a temporary want, but a firm, fixed, immovable liberty party. Human government is for the protection of rights, and when human government destroys human rights, it ceases to be government, and becomes a foul and blasting conspiracy, and is entitled to no respect whatsoever. The man who is right is a majority. He who has God and conscience on his side has a majority against the universe. Though he does not represent the present state, he represents the future state. If he does not represent what we are, he represents what we ought to be. Wilson went into the convention in Pittsburgh supporting Chase for his ability to secure many Democratic votes. For this same reason, he was supported by onlooking Whigs, as a candidate splitting the Democratic vote would lead to a Whig victory. In just one ballot, John Hale was elected as the presidential nominee for the Free Soil Party in 1852. Wilson held no bitter feelings over his preferred candidate losing, and quickly came around to supporting Hale, pleased that the Whigs were upset. As the votes came in at the end of 1852, the Democrats continued their hold on the presidency, with Franklin Pierce winning a second term with just over 50% of the popular vote, but sweeping 27 of the 31 states in the Electoral College. The Free Soilers didn't even break a 0.5%, winning just 155,210 votes across the country. The presidential election of 1852 marked the death of the Whig Party, as no Whig would ever be nominated to the presidency again. It's also the last time the Democratic Party would win the popular vote until 1932. In Massachusetts, the Free Soilers didn't do so well either. The Whigs ended up winning a majority, rendering the coalition essentially powerless. With Pierce reelected, and Massachusetts Democrats now interested in federal appointments, a strong anti-coalitionist sentiment began to rise in the party. Though fractured, the hope for a successful coalition hung on by a thread, and not long after the election, Wilson reignited his ambitions and jumped into his next political endeavor. (1852) was a big year for a national abolitionist event, too, and that was the publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a novel that expresses the horrors of slavery and the hope for a better future through stories of a slave family centering around an Uncle Tom. The book quickly spread across the nation and was the second most-selling book of the 19th century, next only to the Bible. Uncle Tom's Cabin is credited with awakening more anti-slavery fervor in the North, and when Wilson introduced Stowe to Abraham Lincoln on Thanksgiving Day in 1862, Lincoln is noted to have said, quote, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war," end quote. Harriet Beecher Stowe and Henry Wilson's lives overlapped at many moments. Her husband, Calvin Stowe, was from and lived in Natick, Massachusetts. Though she never lived in Natick, Stowe frequently visited the town and based her novel, Old Town Folks, on Natick and the surrounding areas. In her nonfiction book, later in her life, Men of Our Times, also known as Leading Patriots of Our Day, Stowe featured a chapter on Henry Wilson and his work as an abolitionist. That chapter and the entire book can be found on HenryWilsonHistory.com. Back in 1851, when George Boutwell was elected as the governor through the coalition agreement, he ran on the promise of governmental reform in Massachusetts. With Massachusetts dominated by the aristocracy, and with men like Boutwell and Wilson breaking through that exclusionary, undemocratic bend, a spirit of reform filled the state. In an effort to fulfill the call for reform, and in an effort to keep the coalition together, the Free Soilers and Democrats pushed for and won an opportunity to hold a state constitutional convention.
In the Constitutional Convention, one of the main aims of that convention was to, at least in George's eyes, to rectify the inequities of the Massachusetts electoral system, which he thought were too heavily weighed towards the Whig dominance in Boston and other large urban locales to the detriment of the farmers and laborers in central and western Massachusetts. So in one respect, the convention was an absolute, cold-eyed attempt on Boutwell's part and others to rectify the electoral system in Massachusetts. There were also issues of electing judges rather than appointing them, and other parts of the Constitution as well. But it was very much a political exercise to rectify what they saw as political imbalances in the electoral system in Massachusetts.
That was Jeffrey Boutwell, who we heard from last episode as well. Jeffrey is a biographer of George Boutwell and an expert on the politics of Massachusetts in the 19th century. Each legislative district got the opportunity to elect delegates to represent them at the convention. Delegates didn't have to be members of the district which they were elected in, and for that reason Henry Wilson was elected as both a delegate for Natick and a delegate for Berlin, Massachusetts, although he gave his service in Berlin to his friend and former governor George Boutwell, after he lost his own home district.
I love that story. George Boutwell gets defeated in his hometown of Groton, looks as if he won't be able to go to his own convention, but Henry Wilson has run in both Natick and Berlin, said, look, George, I won in Natick, I don't need Berlin. Why don't you go to Berlin and convince the people there to send you to the Constitutional Convention?
Besides Boutwell, Wilson maneuvered and organized seats for many of his political friends and acquaintances, including Charles Sumner and Whig Richard Henry Dana. Dana was never fond of Wilson, though after receiving his seat at the convention he remarked, quote, "He has shown himself a good-natured, well-disposed man, with no personal enmities." End quote. Though Boutwell, Dana, and Sumner were grateful for Wilson's work, Charles Francis Adams and John Palfrey continued their jealousy-driven attacks after Wilson unsuccessfully worked to get them spots as delegates. During the convention, Wilson was elected as the majority leader and got the opportunity to once again use his skills to wrangle and whip a deliberative body. Wilson frequently spoke, and his proposed amendments and motions appear throughout the convention's record. Wilson was a key leader, directing many free soil and Democratic votes. Wilson's charming and politically savvy nature was on full display. Sumner, lacking any practical political skill, bored the delegates with long speeches and failed to formulate a strong popular following, a trait which would continue to highlight the contrast between the two men throughout their closely aligned careers. From May to August 1852, Wilson and the other delegates from across the state negotiated and battled it out for what new amendments should be added to the Constitution. Wilson, mindful of keeping the delegation in one piece, frequently contradicted himself and sacrificed some political principles in favor of political expediency. One example of this was giving smaller, more anti-slavery districts more voting power than the more aristocratic cities and towns like Boston, a proposition Wilson had earlier opposed. The convention adjourned, endorsing 8 amendments to the Massachusetts Constitution. The first was to adopt a new preamble and Bill of Rights. The second, a liberal reform expanding the writ of habeas corpus. The third was a progressive reform on how juries would function in criminal cases. The fourth allowed for judicial investigations against the Commonwealth. The fifth made it unconstitutional to imprison someone for debt. Sixth, that no money raised for public schools should be used to promote religious services. Seventh, a reform to the business incorporation process. And the 8th proposal was a reform to the bank incorporation process. Before the proposals would be voted on by the public, Wilson wrapped himself up into another political venture between the time the convention adjourned in August and the election in November. In September, Wilson's ambitions were once again rewarded when he was overwhelmingly nominated the Free Soil candidate for governor. Wilson received 99% support from the convention, winning 610 of the 615 delegates. Between September and November, Wilson worked vigorously to campaign for both the governor and for the new Constitution. Sumner, Boutwell, and Banks all fought tirelessly as well for the convention's proposals to pass, while Adams and Palfrey, unsurprisingly, fought against them. Adams was further pushed into seeing the proposals fail when he heard of Wilson's nomination for governor. When Massachusetts citizens hit the polls in November, they voted down every proposal, rendering the convention a big waste of time. All of the proposals came close to passing, all just failing by about 1 or 2%. The 6th proposal, which would have limited how school funds could have been used when it came to religious services, came the closest to passing, failing by just 0.3%. The proposals failed due in part to the opposition of a growing faction of Irish Catholics across the state, a group who was an enemy of the Free Soilers, and which would soon catalyze a different movement, sweeping Wilson. The nationally watched governor's race was no better, with Wilson coming in 3rd place behind the Democrat Henry Bishop and winning Whig Emory Washburn. 1853 was a sobering year for Wilson. He tirelessly worked at the convention, which proved to be for nothing. He failed greatly in the race for governor, and he failed to win any political office heading into 1854. His prospects of future success seemed dim, and with little income, Wilson meandered back to his little red shoe shop in Natick, reflecting on his mistakes, lost friends, and failure. With so many compounding losses, all seemed hopeless, but just as he had done so many times before, Wilson pushed forward and once again proved that his talent and underdog status should never be discounted. On this episode, we talked about Henry Wilson's ambitions for the governor's office. We looked at the declining coalition between the Democrats and Free Soilers. We reviewed the election of 1852 and looked at the failed Massachusetts Constitutional Convention of 1853. And then we looked at Wilson's failed bid for governor. This is obviously not the most gripping period in Wilson's life, but just hold on for another episode. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback you'd like to give, please shoot an email to HenryWilsonPodcast@gmail.com. Check out HenryWilsonHistory.com to see images and more resources on Wilson's life. Stay tuned for bonus episodes, and if you haven't already, sign up for the email list to get notifications when new episodes are released. Thank you to all my guests, especially Jeffrey Boutwell. I'll talk with you again in the next episode of Henry Wilson and the Civil War.